trying to get through the roadworks out the front, which I found challenging, so apologies for starting a bit late. I'll be chairing tonight's meeting, and it's really a great opportunity just to showcase some of the research that has been ongoing through the Melanoma Research Victoria cohort study that has been going on for a good number of years now. I think we are, how many, Sonia? 12. 12 years and counting, and getting stronger and stronger, so it's really exciting. So firstly, I'd just like to pay my respects to the elders from the land on which we meet, the people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And thanks to BMS who have kindly supported this meeting tonight. We've got a really great list of speakers at tonight's meeting. We have Alison Button-Sloan, who has been involved with the project really since inception, I think, Alison, isn't that right? Not quite, almost. Who is also always giving a fantastic consumer perspective on our research and informing what our priorities should be. We have Emma Glastonbury, who be very happy to introduce to you all, who is the new lead of SunSmart in Victoria, which is fantastic, and Emma will be talking to us tonight about some of the past achievements of the SunSmart program and where to in the future. And then we have some advances in melanoma treatment, which Lavinia will talk to us about. And then excitingly, the Morgan Mansell Award for this year, 2022, for which we had a number of excellent applications, and it's really exciting to see all the new young researchers coming through in the melanoma space, and that will be presented later in the evening with some of the top ranked applications for this year's round. So before we get to the first speaker tonight, I'll just go through some of the metrics for the Melanoma Research Victoria program, the cohort study, which I think are really impressive. So we had this report come out in our October newsletter that Sonia put together, that we have the number of projects that each MRV participant has been included in is 8. So each participant that we've put in the cohort study, their data or their biospecimens have been used for an average of 8 separate studies, which is really impressive. One single participant was included in 22, so they must have a particularly interesting melanoma, I suspect. And the smallest number of participants in one project is around 5. Most projects are fairly large, so thousands of patients, and the largest being over 3,000. About 51% use clinical data only, 41% use biospecimens and the data, which is really great because we do go to quite a lot of effort, and there is quite a lot of cost also involved in collecting biospecimens. So it's really great to see that they're used for over a number of projects. And then the new data that we have been collecting in more recent times relates to the linkage with Medicare and PBS data, as well as the quality of life measures that we've been taking over time too. And so they've been used in a few projects, and probably something that we'll be looking to increase over the coming years as that data. The PBS and MBS linkage has been a more recent addition. We contribute to about 4 PhDs currently. This year there were 8 projects approved by the Governance Committee. So just so that you know how this approval process works, individual researchers will put together a proposal. That proposal will be sent to the MRV Governance Committee, who will read the proposal and make any approvals, or if necessary go back to the researcher and ask for further justification around their project and why they might like to use, particularly around biospecimen use and so on, to make sure that each bit of tissue that we're collecting is used wisely and for the best purposes. The project categories, so there are 5 clinical projects and 3 more laboratory-based as well. There is a MRV clinical trial called Celebrate, which is led by Grant, and it's looking at triplet combination therapy, and I think that that is really looking at safety and efficacy and looking for expansion ongoing for that. So if there are any questions around use of the data, we're very happy to speak to that, perhaps offline if there are any questions arising from tonight's meeting. But without further ado, I shall introduce Alison Button-Sloan to speak to us about her the consumer perspectives in the MRV program. Thank you, Alison.
Thanks, Dory. Just checking. So hi, I'm Alison Button-Sloan. I'm the chair of the MRV Consumer Reference Group. We're all pointing this way, really, aren't we? So before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land upon which we are meeting this evening. I recognise their strength and resilience and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. So it's great to be here tonight. I think it's been about 2 years since I was last in this building due to the pandemic. So my talk is going to be about consumer engagement in research. So in general, consumer engagement in health has really taken off in the last 5 to 10 years. And there's so much that I could talk about it, but we only have a short time tonight, so we'll see how we go. So the first thing I wanted to say, which is really important, consumers bring valuable expertise from lived experiences as patients and as members of the wider community. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my involvement in research and at the same time use the MRV Consumer Reference Group as another example and what is possible. It's a huge topic and consumer engagement has many benefits, both for the consumer and the researcher. So as a consumer, why engage in research? Well, people want to improve outcomes for other melanoma patients other than themselves, the personal drive to be involved with research, quest for melanoma knowledge. It is democratic as it empowers patients to influence the research agenda. It will enhance the quality of research. It can increase recruitment and assist with retention rates as we have access to the study population being targeted. The lived experience contributes to clinical knowledge. Ask any of the doctors when they talk to their patients about what side effects or how they're going. There is the ever-changing development of medical diagnostics, treatment and care, that these all affect the priorities of patients affected by cancer. And there's a need to represent the collective patient voice. And then last but not least, there's the health dollar and accountability. These grants are normally taxpayer funded, so it's important that we spend wisely. So now what I'm going to do is talk about how I started as a consumer with research. I was very keen, but very green. So I joined in 2014. Everyone was very welcoming, from Sonia to Paul White, who was the then chair. However, oops, hang on, let's go back a bit. There we go. However, aside from my diagnosis, I knew very little about melanoma. I had a low level of confidence as a consumer. I really was engaged from a distance. I would just, sit back and listen to everybody else. I had a poor understanding of research and its importance, and I felt somewhat intimidated by the professors and doctors and whatnot, which was surprising because I I'm actually a registered nurse, and you'd think you'd be used to dealing with these people, but I think it's because I thought I was back in the patient role. Anyway, we soon got over that. So, and what did surprise me was that at some point, as a consumer, you suddenly had speed dial access to these clinicians, which surprised me. So that was very nice. So standing here today, I just didn't get here by chance. It's been 8 years in the making. Experienced consumers aren't made overnight. I think I was in the right place at the right time because so many opportunities came my way, and like a child in a lolly shop, I took all of them. Well, almost. So I educated myself because, as I said, I didn't have much melanoma knowledge. I read journal articles, talked to the clinicians, I networked, I attended training workshops and melanoma and cancer conferences. Some were sponsored, some were self-funded. And before long, I was being invited to join various organisations as a consumer representative. So, of course, we've got MRV. And then we moved down the list, the melanoma guidelines, the Victorian Cancer Registry, melanoma and skin cancer trials, Cancer Council, and the Primary Care Collaborative Trials Group. And at the same time, when I moved to Melbourne, 9 years ago, there was no support group down here for melanoma patients. So I set that up and ran that for 8 years. That was in conjunction with MPA. So where are we at the moment? It's well and truly embedded in research consumer engagement. The major funding bodies require your applications to have had our input, which is fair enough considering that we, the patients, will be the ultimate beneficiaries. So here we have a table listing the 6 categories of consumer involvement that Sonia Mailer put together last year as part of her master's. And it neatly demonstrates that the consumer reference group members are involved at every level of research. Excuse me. So we have, so it starts from the lowest form, which is not, I'm not using that term derogatory, but informing, consulting, involving, partnership, and then the 2 high-level ones, consumer-led advocacy and consumer-led research. So it can range from training and attending conferences all the way down to being listed as an investigator on a grant application, to being a co-author on a peer-reviewed journal article. But I'd like to just point out for consumer-led advocacy, some of the activities this is the consumer reference group we participated in, have included the Australian Cancer Plan, which will be published in early 2023, that's next year. We've done multiple PBAC submissions to obtain PBS listing of the life-saving medicines for melanoma patients. There's been attendance at government inquiries into the high cost of cancer treatments and medicines. And we participated in the Melanoma State of the Nation report that was released earlier this year. So then we get down to consumer-led research. So for the first time this year, the MRFF invited grant applications for consumer-led research in the category of preventative and public health. So with the support of UQ and clinicians from Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, including Tori here, the ASMID Consumer Engagement Panel has made a submission, and I've been listed as the Chief Investigator, which I was pretty amazed. And although I've been an Associate Investigator with various trials and studies, I had no idea how complex the process is. So I very much take my hat off to those of you who do this regularly. Now, carrying over from that previous slide, Sonia Mailer is the lead author. Joe Brito and I did an audit and evaluation of consumer engagement activities for the 10 years from 2010 to 2020. Past and present consumers' activities were audited, and this included a validation process reviewing the 6 categories of consumer engagement. There was a total of 645 advocacy and research activities, and these were coded according to the engagement levels, so informing, consulting, involving, partnership. With internal validation, there were only 30 discrepancies, and they were resolved. So here you can see the activity levels summarised and graphed over time, and of particular note, 41% of consumer engagement with MRV was 41%. Consumer engagement and research was 41%, which is pretty amazing, I think. So now we come to the future. Certainly for the CRG, we have matured from our humble beginnings to a group where there is a history of measurable consumer and researcher collaborations. And we intend to build on this. Consumers are increasingly involved in research, and we as patients have much riding on the fruits of your research. We are totally invested and want you to succeed. And who knows, one of you one day could be, I'm talking more about the young researchers, well, it could be, you know, the next Jim Allison or Peter Doherty. But I'd also, so if I go over here, we've mentioned the chief investigator for the consumer-led grant application. I just wanted to mention about the MRV consumer group for those who are not quite aware about what we do. So we're volunteers, we're all at different points in our work and life and health. There's all levels from beginners to experts. And what we will continue to do, it's all been turned around a little bit, hasn't it, with the pandemic, but we'll continue to do our project reviews, and we're inviting more and more of the researchers to come and do presentations for us. And there's always a Q&A after that, so that's great. And you can gain multiple points of view. But we can also provide input into the initial stages of your research. Are you asking the right question? Is your project relevant? What impact will it make on patient care and treatment? And how translational will the results be? And we're also encouraging one-on-one consumer researcher relationships. Now, I know the funding opportunities for 2023 have been released. I'm pretty sure they have. So the CRG and the project review group are available to assist you. So please don't hesitate to contact Sonia. And that's it. Thank you. Do I close that? No. Don't touch.
Thank you, Alison. It's amazing, amazing amount of work really that goes into reviewing projects and providing your expertise and that of the consumer reference group. So thank you for all the work that you do, and it's a really important piece of work to make sure that we are focused on what we should be. So yeah, it's fantastic and a really fantastic initiative that I think MRV have been really leading in this space. So our next speaker, I'd like to warmly welcome Emma Glastonbury has taken over from Heather Walker as the head of SunSmart in Victoria. And as we know, Victoria has really been a leading state for melanoma and skin cancer early detection and prevention through the SunSmart strategy over the years, and various campaigns from Slip, Slop, Slap that has really started to make a tangible difference in the rates of melanoma that we see, particularly amongst young people. So welcome, Emma, and thanks for coming tonight in person, and it's great to have you with us.
Okay, thanks, Tori. Okay, perfect. So, hi everyone, I'm Emma Glastonbury and I'm the head of SunSmart, and today I'm just going to provide you with an overview of the current trends and the evidence underpinning the SunSmart program. But before I start, just let you know that we are funded by the Victorian Government and Cancer Council Victoria, and there's about a team of 9 of us, which includes program coordinators, media and comms, and also research and evaluation teams. So it's not just me. Yeah, it's a bit more accurate, isn't it? So as most of you would know, that Australia has the highest rate of skin cancer in the world, and 2 in 3 Australians will develop skin cancer in their lifetime. And in Victoria alone, there was 2,500 people were diagnosed with melanoma in 2020, and 271 people lost their lives, which was higher than the state road toll. And it is also the most costly cancer to treat at $1.7 billion each year. Is that ultraviolet radiation from the sun is the primary cause of skin cancer, and estimated that 99% of non-melanoma skin cancers and 95% of melanoma are caused by overexposure of UV radiation. The fact that skin cancer is largely caused by UV radiation means it's also highly preventable. So by using good sun protection, consisting of a combination of 5 measures, including sunscreen, clothing, wide-brimmed hats, shade and sunglasses, encapsulated by the well-known phrase slip, slop, slap, seek and slide. So this is where SunSmart comes into play. Many of you would already know SunSmart program, and it's a world-renowned leader in skin cancer prevention, and its global influence can't be underestimated, with many other countries taking on elements of the program, such as New Zealand, Ireland and Denmark. So the SunSmart program has been running for over 30 years now, starting off in the 1980s after the iconic Slip, Slop, Slap campaign. SunSmart was formed in Victoria to minimise the human cost of skin cancer in Victoria. So the SunSmart initiatives are intensive community engagement underpinned by mass media campaigns. And over the history of SunSmart, Cancer Council Victoria has been designated a World Health Organization collaborative centre for skin cancer, played an advocacy role, including of the banning of solariums in 2015, and seen the iconic Slip, Slop, Slap expanded to include Seek and Slide, which of course is our shade and sunglasses. So what are some of the changes that we've seen over time during the SunSmart era? We all know the Australian lifestyle. We are outdoors. We love our white sandy beaches, but we also have extremely high UV levels. So it's positive to see some improved role modelling over the years. So here you can see we've had the shift to the lifeguards using wide brimmed hats, protective clothing such as long sleeves top with the collar, longer shorts compared to the budgies, and of course, not so clear here, but you can see it, the sunglasses. But we've improved beyond the beach. Primary schools of an area that we are really proud of and made huge gains and been instrumental in achieving considerable cultural shift in sun protection norms in primary schools, thanks to our SunSmart Schools program. So here you can see kids in 1991 compared to what you see today. So with policy, no hats, no play, the kids are encouraged wide brim hats to play in the playground from mid-August to April. But there's also been positive improvements in shade provision in public places, schools, early childhood, pools and parks. And research keeps telling us that if shade is available, people will use it. So well-designed and positioned shade can not only significantly reduce UV exposure, but also create cool, comfortable spaces for physical activity and recreation. So in 2015, the Victorian government initiated the Shade Grants program, whereby over 1,600 grants have been provided to date through the Schools and Community Grants program to increase shade provision in Victoria. So this is just an example at a school playground, but also a public swimming pool. So you can see the increase in shade. So if we look at the Victorian Cancer Registry data, the melanoma incidence and mortality for males is higher than for females. So the white dots, the dots on the right-hand side, the top two dots are incidence and the bottom two are deaths from melanoma. And you can see that the males, which are the white dots, are higher for both incidence and mortality, and in fact have twice the mortality of women. You will see also that the incident rates have started to flatten out from the late 1990s, and that's thanks to likely to be better treatments and possibly early detection. And we've seen mortality rates reduce, particularly in the last 7 years. And we're also seeing, as Tori mentioned before, stabilising or declining rates for people under 60 years of age in Victoria, and it's likely to be due to intensive prevention programs such as the SunSmart program, which is to help see those decline in numbers. So do we know that sun protection behaviours work? We've seen a change in sun protection behaviours because of the SunSmart program. Well, this graph is from a paper that looked at sun protection behaviours through a population survey starting before the SunSmart program and has tracked them over the following decades. And on this graph, you can see that the use of hats, sunscreen, and at least one sun protection behaviour increased dramatically in the first 10 years since the introduction of the SunSmart program, and we have been able to maintain those behaviours since over the decades. We can also see from the yellow line that the prevalence of people in outdoors in peak UV time over summer also declined over the same period. So this paper is also from the same, this graph's also from the same paper, and it shows that the odds of sunburn also when outdoor during peak UV on summer weekends has also significantly decreased since 1987. And using maximal sun protection, which is 3 forms of sun protection and defined as hat, clothing and sunscreen when outdoors, also has significantly increased. So we can see the impact on prevention messaging and campaigns and community engagement and how that has had an impact on sun protection behaviours. So is skin cancer prevention good value for money? Yes, we think it is. In a study from 2019, an economic evaluation by SHE found that the SunSmart program prevented more than 100,000 skin cancers and 1,000 deaths alone. And then if an additional 16 cents per person was invested into skin cancer prevention, we would prevent 140,000 skin cancers over the next 20 years. And for every dollar invested, we'd have a $3.20 investment in return. So really showing value for money in skin cancer prevention programs. So where does the SunSmart program operate? Where are we? We work in key settings. So as I mentioned, the key settings are based on our audience groups. So firstly, we have children, where we have the SunSmart membership program in primary schools and early childhood settings, reaching over 90% of all primary schools and early childhoods, and reaching over 650,000 children and their families. We also are targeting young people, particularly adolescents, so those in secondary schools. And although adolescents have quite good knowledge of what they're meant to do, they don't do it. So it is a bit of a battle. And it's also, we don't have mandated policies in secondary schools either. So really we continue to provide direct support to schools to try and encourage that behaviour change, either working directly with students, teachers or school nurses, and having that constant presence. Although we would like to see more mandates in secondary schools to truly try and shift that behaviour change. We also work with the older men audience. As we saw before, they have a higher incidence and mortality of melanoma, but also they're a little bit complacent with their sun protection behaviours, and they're also more likely to spend time outdoors during peak UV times. So how do we reach men? It's predominantly through our workplace UV safety training, particularly in regional Victoria and out for people who work outdoors, because we know that people who work outdoors have 5 to 10 times the UV exposure that people work indoors. We also have a focus in regional Victoria, just because the incidence of melanoma in regional Victoria is 40% greater. So we truly try and tap into the regional communities to try and educate them on sun protection behaviours. So our workplace UV safety program is all around introducing policies, but also education. So we know that policies along with education simultaneously provide the best results. And then not lastly, our health professional audience, which are really pivotal in being able to arm them with early detection and prevention messages and education, as they are also usually our first point of call for people with skin cancer. So this graph shows how our membership rate has increased over time in both schools and early childhood program. So you can see that the schools program started in 1994, and ever since then we've had a steady increase of membership and now have a plateauing of 89% of all Victorian schools, primary schools, are a member of the SunSmart program. Early childhood started a little bit later, involving childcare, preschools and kindergartens, and commenced in 1996, and family daycare centres in 2003. But you can see from this graph they've caught up to the primary school years program. Again, 89% of all early childhood centres in Victoria are members of the SunSmart program. So this is really encouraging to see, as we know from the evidence, that those people who are members have significantly better sun protection measures in place. And what about our workforce strategy? This has been really pivotal, particularly of recent years, in terms of early detection of skin cancer and helping build the capacity of the Victorian health professionals with education resources. A key component of this program has been our GP dermoscopy program, which started as a philanthropy grant in 2018, and we have been able to build it year on year to train over 300 GPs in the use of, with a dermatoscope and the use of dermoscopy to detect cancer early and accurately. So this has been something that we have been able to grow over the recent years and really have a focus of those GPs in regional Victoria, where obviously access to specialists is not as great as in metro areas, but also address the higher incidence of melanoma in these regions as well. So campaigns is a core component of our work, and we know they work. Campaigns are really important. Mass media, prevention, education campaigns are a really important way to get our message out there and remind people of sun protection behaviours. So as you can see from this graph, it was on a study that looked at advertising and the amount of advertising in terms of reach and frequency, which is referred to as TARPs on this graph. And you can see that as the advertising increased, so did the use of sunscreen, and there was a decrease of the percentage of body part exposed to UV. So we know that campaigns and mass media campaigns are really important and core to our work. So next week is National Skin Cancer Action Week, and we're going to be on air from Sunday with our Same Goes For You campaign. This campaign will be on TV, digital, radio and outdoor media, and it's all about addressing men aged 40 to 59 around their sun protection behaviours. As I mentioned before, a little bit complacent, tend to protect their deck, their car and the barbecue from the UV, but don't tend to protect themselves. So in the ad, which I'm going to show you in a moment, a boy who's the son of the dad reminds his dad to protect himself like he's just protected his possessions. So our key message of this campaign is when you cover things up, they last longer. So cover yourself up this summer. Are you going to help me do this? So we have to exit and I'm going to show you the ad.
This protects the dew coat from the sun. This stops the timber getting wrecked by UV. Always put the sun, mate. Keeps it in good nick.
When we cover things, they last longer.
Hey, Dad!
Same goes for you. Twice as many men as women die from melanoma in Australia. At its most aggressive, skin cancer can spread to internal organs like the lungs and brain and become deadly quicker than you think. Be sun smart. Save your skin.
So we'll be running that this summer for the third year in a row, actually, because it has performed really well in terms of prompted recognition and message takeout and the intent of people to increase their sun protection behaviours after seeing the ad. And we'll have it 2 bursts, one before Christmas and then obviously in January and February as well. And just as for you're here, if you couldn't do it, I would definitely not be able to do it. What's up? Oh, that's okay.
While we're waiting, which is so you obviously employ an ad company to put all that together, do you? And what's the process behind putting that powerful ad?
Yeah, so, well, there is an ad company behind it, but there's a huge amount of research that goes through it beforehand as well. So what we would do is someone like myself and the behavioural research person in the team will work together to brief. So we do a lot of focus. Again into consumer testing, pick out the favourite ad, then test it for cognitive response and message takeout, and if all going well, we'll air it. So the ads, there's a huge amount of insights. I know it's only 30 seconds, but there's 8 months, 9 months behind it to really try and drive that behaviour change. So has SunSmart made a difference? We would absolutely like to think that we're contributing to the stable or declining incidence of melanoma for those people under 60 years of age who have lived during the SunSmart era. We do see increased use of hats, sunscreens, reduction in sunburn and decreased desire to tan in our behaviour population surveys. And we know we are good value for money and health-saving intervention. So what can you do? You can understand what the UV is, and knowing when it's above 3, take out sun protection measures, and we can help provide you with the guidance of when the UV is above 3. We have the SunSmart app, which each day will give you the predicted or the live UV and the predicted sun protection times. And then we also have the widget on for websites as well. And it uses forecast information from the Bureau of Meteorology and also live data from the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency. So really making people aware of when they need sun protection. And generally in Victoria, it's around mid-August to April. And most of those days, although the UV varies across that time and is higher at noon, cloud cover can lower the UV, but generally speaking, UV is not dependent on temperature, it's independent of temperature. So it's really important to use sun protection with UV rather than heat. And finally, a reminder of the 5 sun protection behaviours: slip, slop, slap, seek and slide. And our job's absolutely not done. We're here to remind everyone in Victoria, across the state, with our campaigns of when's a good time to start sun protection behaviour. But we also want to continue with those new generations coming through to educate them and get sun protection behaviours early and hopefully lifelong. So that's it for me.
Thanks, Emma. I might ask you to start. Are there any questions for Emma? It's really great actually just to understand a little bit more about how SunSmart works behind the scenes, because I think we're all familiar with some of the ads and the work that you do, but it's really nice to have that explained. How do we tackle that adolescent group?
Oh, and it's really hard, isn't it? Because they've come through the schools program, their knowledge is good, but they don't do it. So it's a really tricky age group. And it's not only just in terms of sun protection, we see it in terms of diet and lifestyle as well. So it's a lot of behavioural change for that adolescent group. But the best change we can see is probably mandating, particularly in schools. So like the primary schools, you can't go outside unless you have a hat. The provision of shade, we know they like shade, having access to sunscreen, and even having T-shirts with collars is a step in the right direction. But it's going to be hard to get that shift unless we see more policies in schools.
Have to get onto TikTok.
Yeah, I mean, my experience anecdotally, just having children go through primary and then just finish secondary school last week, it was that, the teachers were all over this issue at primary school, but not at all in secondary school.
Yeah, and so you're not alone.
So the weren't even thinking about it. There was no, so it would only came from the kids at all, which was
yeah, and it's pretty hard to be the only kid who wears a broad brim hat, isn't it? Yeah. Unless we have that social norm that everyone wears it. So I think it's going to have to be something that's addressed through policy. Yeah,
and through the sporting activities that they might
exactly. So also where kids are after school as well. So whether that be sporting events, because we also know at rowing, for instance, the exposure in the sun, which is a summer sport, is huge. So we've got work to do in certain sectors of the sport as well.
Obviously, it's super exciting that the rates of melanoma appear to be decreasing, and you find it hard to believe that's not related to the efforts from you guys since the 1980s. What about non-melanoma skin cancers? Are they going down? Like, what's the incidence of those? I know it's a little harder to track because they're data.
Yeah, because they're through Medicare data, as where the melanoma rates are through the Victorian Cancer Registry, so it makes it easier to track. But I think that for Medicare, it's the number of treatments from the non-melanoma skin cancers. And from my last record on it, you might be able to help me out, Victoria, that they look like they're not declining.
I think that it's difficult to show, isn't it? Because it's an ageing population and it's predominantly in that older age groups too.
And one person can have multiple excisions as well, or treatments.
Yeah. Yeah. And once they start seeing somebody to treat those, they tend to keep coming back with them.
And of course, it's that older age group as well.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much. It's really fantastic to hear what's happening. We might move on now to Lavinia's talk. Lavinia's online and is going to speak to us about some of the advances in management of melanoma. So thanks, Lavinia. Do we have audio?
Hi, everybody. Sorry, just bear with me while I sort out the technology. And thank you. And thanks for the invitation to speak. And I'm sorry I can't be there tonight. Unfortunately, we've had a household COVID epidemic. But I am pleased to talk to you about the advances in the management of melanoma with a focus on systemic therapies. Just trying to figure out disclosures. And I was reflecting that really it's been 20 years of great progress for patients with advanced melanoma, as in 2002, the Nature paper describing the enrichment of mutations in the BRAF gene in melanoma patients was first published. And that really led to a series of, or an era of targeted therapy and fantastic early PET scan responses with single agent BRAF inhibitors. And then in 2010 as well, the advent of ipilimumab demonstrating an overall survival benefit in a population of patients who hadn't yet had systemic therapies that were particularly effective. And then in 2015, we sort of saw this wave of publications of superiority of anti-PD-1 over ipilimumab, the advantage of combination nivo and ipilimumab, and the combination of dabrafenib and trametinib, or combination targeted BRAF MEK approaches versus single agent. And then really the focus sort of started to shift to bringing forward those therapies into the adjuvant space with both immune therapies and targeted therapies. But we still have a way to go to achieve a cure for all. And I think 2022 has certainly been a great 12 months of progress. So I'm going to be slightly ambitious and talk about 5 different areas: anti-PD-1 adjuvant therapy in resected stage 2 melanoma, the really exciting space of neoadjuvant immune checkpoint blockade in resectable stage 3 disease, and then talk about the sort of new IO combination, anti-PD-1 plus anti-LAG3, and then touch upon tumor infiltrating lymphocytes and to finish the influence of diet on immunotherapy response, which is great. So stage 2 melanoma, well, we certainly know, and it's a standard of care to give adjuvant anti-PD-1 with nivolumab or pembrolizumab, or indeed adjuvant targeted therapy in resected stage 3 disease. That is, patients who have loco-regional nodal involvement, be that macroscopic or sentinel node. And roughly at 3 years, as a 60% recurrence-free rate in favour of adjuvant therapy, but we've not yet seen any overall survival advantage because we can rescue many patients with effective systemic therapies later on. And when we look at the melanoma-specific survival for stage 3B, it's actually comparable to that for stage 2C disease, which is a primary melanoma without nodal involvement. And the rationale for bringing forward the adjuvant therapies is obviously there. And this year we've had 2 trials, phase 3 studies, report a recurrence-free survival advantage in favour of anti-PD-1 therapies over placebo treatment in resected stage 2B and C melanoma. The Keynote study, which randomised patients in a 1-to-1 manner to pembrolizumab or placebo, and the Checkmate study, which randomised patients in a 2-to-1 manner in favour of nivolumab. And roughly the T-stage breakdown in each of these studies was similar. And the primary endpoint was recurrence-free survival as deemed by the investigators. There's more mature data for the pembrolizumab study, so I'll discuss that in a little bit more detail. But this really is the key slide. We see an improved recurrence-free survival with both approaches. On the left, the the Keynote pembrolizumab study, we've got the blue, these are Kaplan-Meier recurrence-free survival curves. The blue group denotes those who received pembrolizumab. Here on the left, red placebo, and on the right, nivolumab, in green at the top. The hazard ratios differ, but one can't compare across studies. But the landmark recurrence-free rates at 12 months are very similar, with about 90% of patients who receive anti-PD-1 who have not recurred, versus around 80% in the placebo arm, noting, of course, that the majority of patients in the placebo arm still haven't recurred. In terms of a bit further follow-up with the pembrolizumab data, the hazard ratio of 0.64 is relatively constant, as is that sort of absolute benefit of around sort of 8%. And we see this as well for nivolumab, that there's benefit in each of the T-stage subcategories. Where I would have hypothesized perhaps at the T4B subgroup, so that's ulcerated, thick primary melanomas greater than 4 millimeters, might have had more benefit. It seemed to be very much sort of the same across the subgroups. The pembrolizumab study is also reported on distant metastasis-free survival data, and here we see this was a secondary endpoint in that study, a statistically significant improvement, so fewer patients with distant metastases. At 2 years, 88% of patients who received pembrolizumab were distant metastasis-free versus 82% who received placebo, and this was a significant result for a secondary endpoint. Again, noting the high rate of patients in the placebo arm, though, without distant metastases. And really what drives this is a reduction in the rate of patients having lung metastases, but other sites of disease, such as the brain and liver, which can be quite clinically significant, that were lower in number, but didn't seem to have that same relative advantage. And what about toxicity? Always a consideration with adjuvant therapy, particularly where many patients may be cured anyway. It was comparable to the stage 3 and 4 scenarios, with a grade 3-4 toxicity rate or moderate to severe toxicity rate of around 10 to 16%. And when I talk to patients about adjuvant anti-PD-1, it's always included in the discussion that risk, which might be small though, of permanent or life-altering side effects. And indeed, they saw a rate of around 1% of patients developing type 1 diabetes or less. And in the Keynote study, a number of neurological syndromes that can also be quite morbid. So we have 2 studies demonstrating a similar result in terms of improved recurrence-free survival with adjuvant anti-PD-1, certainly consistent and more than we can say for the renal cancer adjuvant studies that read out this year. But in a population where most will be cured by surgery alone, and still a decent rate of moderate to severe toxicity, and I think it's unlikely we're going to see overall survival benefit. How do we not overtreat this group of patients? Should we be saving checkpoint blockade for later? And I think it will be important to work on biomarkers and also see what the targeted therapies studies show in this space as well. So in terms of the neoadjuvant approaches in stage 3 melanoma, there were 4 neoadjuvant studies that reported in the last 12 months, but I'm going to focus in particular on the SWOG 1801 study, which was really the first trial to demonstrate or randomize a neoadjuvant versus an adjuvant approach with single-agent pembrolizumab, and then talk about neoadjuvant ipi-nivo as part of the Prado cohort reported at ASCO. So what is the rationale? Why is neoadjuvant therapy potentially or probably actually better when one has a tumour in situ with all of the tumour-infiltrating lymphocytes that are present? There's a greater potential for immune checkpoint blockade to enhance that anti-tumour immune response, and with greater clonal expansion that can persist and have greater immune memory subsequent to the surgery. So what do we know about neoadjuvant therapy to date? Well, we know that pathologic response is prognostic, and we now have some nice categories of pathologic response, from complete response, near complete response, which is often combined with complete response to talk about a major pathological responding group, partial, and then the non-responders. We know that immune checkpoint inhibitors demonstrate more durable outcomes than BRAF/MEK inhibition in this space. And we know that pathologic complete response rates are much higher with combination immune checkpoint blockade, in the order of 43% for complete response versus 20% for monotherapy. So at ESMO this year, the SWOG 1801 study was reported, and I think this is a great study. It was a randomized phase 2 designed in patients with resectable macroscopic stage 3B to 4 melanoma. The stage 4 was a very small subpopulation, and patients were randomized in a 1-to-1 manner to receive either be on the adjuvant arm, so have their surgery followed by standard of care, 18 cycles of pembrolizumab, or receive 3 cycles of neoadjuvant pembrolizumab followed by surgery, followed by a completion adjuvant course. The primary endpoint was event-free survival, which captured, of course, tumor-related progression and recurrence, but also failure to receive surgery or failure to start adjuvant therapy, so a broader capture. 313 patients were randomized, and a minority had stage 3B disease, so I would say this is a reasonably high-risk population. It met its primary endpoint, showing a statistically significant improvement in event-free survival with the neoadjuvant approach. At 2 years, 72% of patients in the neoadjuvant arm were event-free and 49% in the adjuvant therapy arm with a hazard ratio of 0.58. The overall survival data is not yet mature, but I think watch this space. The curves do appear to separate. And the response data has not really yet been reported, but reassuringly, they saw a 21% rate of complete pathologic response, which is in keeping with what's been seen in earlier studies with PD-1 monotherapy. So conclusions being really, we're seeing for the first time randomized data showing an event-free survival significantly longer in the neoadjuvant arm, fewer tumor-related events. And I didn't present it, but the pembrolizumab was safe, no sort of new safety signals seen in that sort of perioperative context. So, does this really represent a new standard of care? Moving on to the Prado study, which is a wonderful sort of investigator-initiated sort of group of studies looking at neoadjuvant ipilimumab and nivolumab. And this study had a different approach. This was a trial that was looking to sort of confirm pathologic response rate and recurrence-free survival rates that they'd seen in an earlier cohort of patients in a dose-finding setting. And this trial recruited 99 patients with resectable stage 3B to D melanoma. They couldn't have had any in-transit metastases in the last 6 months and had to have a normal LDH. Patients received 2 cycles of ipilimumab and nivolumab, but with the reverse dosing to what we give in the metastatic setting, which is associated with fewer adverse events. They then went on to have an index lymph node resected, and then it was really on the basis of the pathological response seen on this index lymph node that dictated the further treatment. In patients that had 10% or less of viable tumour, which included the complete responders, they didn't go on to have a completion nodal dissection nor further systemic therapy. Those who had a partial response, that is 10 to 50% of viable tumour remaining, completed their lymph node dissection but did not have any further therapy. And the non-responders who had more than 50% of viable tumour had a lymph node dissection, and then they had further adjuvant therapy because in this previous study, that group had done quite poorly. And so one of the sort of endpoints was to see whether they could really rescue this group of patients and their outcomes. So 99 patients were enrolled. Just to flag, 6 patients did have distant metastases after 2 cycles at that week 6 scan, and 10 only received 1 cycle of ipilimumab nivolumab due to toxicity. So overall in the study, because it incorporated a proportion of patients that had further therapy, 30% still had grade 3 or 4 moderate to severe immune-related toxicity, only 22% though in the first 12 weeks. And the pathologic response rates were nearly equivalent to what had been seen in earlier studies, with a complete response rate of 49% and a major pathologic response rate of 61%. So that's more than half of the patients having less than 10% of viable tumour remaining after those 2 cycles of treatment. This slide is showing on the left, the relapse-free survival curve, and in the middle, the distant metastasis-free survival curve, split by the degree of pathologic response. So in green are those who had that major pathologic response. In the yellow line represents those with a partial pathologic response, and the red are the non-responders. And even though they had pre-specified a 97% recurrence-free survival rate at 2 years as their sort of feasibility endpoint, they didn't quite meet that, but still, I think, very impressive. 93% of patients, which was the majority with this major pathologic response, were recurrence-free at 2 years, 98% were free of distant metastases at 2 years. And what is interesting here is the rate of response or recurrence-free survival in the non-responders in the earlier Opus and Neo cohort. Of those patients who had more than 50% of viable tumour remaining, the non-responders, only 36% were recurrence-free at 2 years, whereas in this study with ongoing systemic therapy, the recurrence-free survival rate was 71%. So these patients were essentially rescued with further treatment. So 2 cycles of Ipi-Nivo at the Ipi light or less toxic dosing induced a major pathologic response, an excellent recurrence-free survival, and I think it is feasible to therefore de-escalate the systemic treatment in those patients with that major pathologic response. But ongoing systemic therapy is obviously needed in the non-responders and should be given in the partial responders. And I think in terms of the extent of surgery required, I haven't gone into that data for today, but watch this space. Perhaps it will be feasible to avoid total lymph node dissections in a group of patients in future. And importantly, this paradigm is being investigated in a randomized phase 3 trial to hopefully remove that equipoise that's there around, is neoadjuvant therapy better than adjuvant treatment? And I think, probably based on the data I've presented, my gut feeling is that neoadjuvant approach is going to win out. So then in terms of stage 4 treatment updates, we have a new immunotherapy combination to sort of discuss. So just to recap, ipilimumab and nivolumab used as first-line therapy and really investigated through the Checkmate 067 trial has shown a fantastic improvement in survival relative to ipilimumab in stage 4 melanoma when given as first-line treatment. And these responses are durable. And we now have data with a minimum follow-up of 7.5 years from this study, showing an overall survival rate of 48% in those patients who received Ipi-Nivo. We know this is probably going to be higher in the subgroup of patients with BRAF V600 mutations. An impressive outcome too in those having single-agent nivolumab, 42% alive at 7.5 years, and these patients are now dying of other causes. But the catch of Ipi-Nivo in particular has always been the toxicity, with a high rate, more than 50% of patients developing significant toxicity. And we shouldn't underestimate toxicity. I think the rates of chronic toxicity have been underreported. And this is a really nice review paper looking at this, in fact. And although we know that endocrine side effects mandate lifelong replacement, there are quite high rates of ongoing pneumonitis, arthritis, ocular toxicity, and persistent neurological morbidity beyond 3 months in a large proportion of patients. So we have relatlimab, which is an anti-LAG3 antibody being combined with nivolumab in a phase 2/3 study where that combination was compared to nivolumab alone. And we've got, sorry, let me just, that stopped working. 1 second. I think my computer's having a mini meltdown. I'm frozen on my slide. Sorry, 1 second. We've got down here on the right a diagram showing T cells and interacting with cancer cells, and LAG3 and PD-1 are both co-expressed on exhausted T cells. So there's a rationale to inhibit both to augment that anti-tumor response. So what about the 2 power couples that we now have, not to do a cross-trial comparison, but more to provide some context? The relativity study of nivolumab, relatlimab versus nivolumab alone had a powered comparison of the doublet to nivolumab, which we didn't have for the Checkmate 067 study, where both the Ipi-Nivo and the Nivo arms were powered to be compared to ipilimumab monotherapy. I think overall the cohorts were reasonably comparable, but with perhaps a higher rate though of M1C disease that's visceral organ disease in the patients in the Checkmate 067 study. Of course, median follow-up is only 19 months for the nivolumab relatlimab study, so just to bear that in mind as well. Just for context, again, I have put in red the equivalent sort of figures from the Checkmate 067 study, but the primary endpoint of the relativity study was to compare the progression-free survival by a blinded independent review committee. And we see a significant reduction in the risk of progression with a hazard ratio of 0.78 in favour of the combination. The median progression-free survival of nivolumab relatlimab was 10.22 months versus 4.63 for nivolumab alone. And in the 067 study, Ipi-Nivo, the median progression-free survival was 11.5 months, so similar. The overall survival data is not yet mature for the Nivo-Rela versus Nivo study, but the hazard ratio is 0.8 and trending in the right direction. And with only a median of sort of 19 months follow-up, I have put in a comparison of the 24-month landmark overall survival, which is quite comparable again to Ipi-Nivo and Nivo from the 067 study. In terms of response rates, nivolumab relatlimab certainly had a higher response rate at 43% versus 32.6% in those patients who received nivolumab alone. Again, not doing formal cross-trial comparisons, but certainly we did see a bit of a higher rate with Ipi-Nivo, but that was across both arms of that study too. But I think the real advantage in this combination, not only do we know now that it's more efficacious than single agent, but it has a toxicity rate that is much lower than the combination of Ipi-Nivo. 21% of patients developed grade 3-4 adverse events versus 11% on nivolumab monotherapy on this study. And a lower rate had treatment discontinuation, whereas Ipi-Nivo, 56%. So I think that the advantage here is this superior safety profile. So with manageable toxicity rates, greater efficacy than single agent, the question really then becomes, if we were to have this available, who still needs that anti-CTLA-4? And certainly there are some subgroups for whom we've got a very established benefit of Ipi-Nivo over nivolumab monotherapy, particularly those with brain metastases, probably the VRAF V600 mutant cohort, melanomas harboring that mutation and other subtypes. So I'm conscious of time, but I wanted to talk a bit about tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, as I think the adoptive therapies are getting a lot of attention and press and are a really exciting space. But there are certainly significant challenges still in both delivery of this sort of treatment, but also patient selection. So for tumor infiltrating lymphocyte therapy or TIL therapy, patients need to have a lesion that's amenable to resection, that they also have to be treated in a centre that has the capacity and resourcing to isolate those TILs, to culture them, expand them, to reinfuse them. But prior to that, patients have to be fit enough to have a lymphodepleting chemotherapy regimen. And then subsequent to the TIL infusion, patients need to be fit enough, again, to receive high doses of interleukin, which can cause cytokine release syndrome and other side effects. And this whole process takes weeks. So this is not a treatment opportunity for rapid progressors. But it was nice to see, again, at ESMO, the first randomized phase 3 study looking at TILs versus a standard of care, in this case, TILs versus ipilimumab. And this was in a cohort of patients with unresectable stage 3, or the majority did have stage 4 melanoma. They were randomized in a 1-to-1 manner to the TILs versus ipilimumab treatment. But notably, of the 199 patients screened, there were a number who were unable to proceed because of rapid progression. And just to note, 90% of patients had received anti-PD-1 treatment prior, some of those as an adjuvant therapy, and 80% had a normal LDH, so a better prognostic subgroup. So again, this study met its primary endpoint with a superior progression-free survival in favour of TILs with a hazard ratio of 0.5. And what was impressive was that the response rate of in the group that received TILs was double that of ipilimumab, 42% versus 21%. This is a slide from a study published last year, a single-arm study of more heavily treated patient group who had TIL therapy with a response rate of 36%. But after a median follow-up of 18 months, the median duration of response had not been reached. So I think there's a lot of promise with a one-off infusion of one therapy. One can see with the upside-down blue triangles, the responses occur early, great potential for durable responses, which is exciting. The toxicity, though, can be significant, as I mentioned, and a lot of patients developed febrile neutropenia. Patients also, of course, develop toxicity with immune checkpoint blockade, and we saw a high rate of colitis and diarrhea as expected with ipilimumab alone. So in this patient group, the response rate was doubled with TILs. The progression risk was halved versus ipilimumab, but it was a highly selected subgroup. We know that responses to ipi-nivo subsequent to anti-PD-1 therapy are in the order of 30%, and it's an easier regimen to deliver in every centre as opposed to just in big centres where TIL therapy and adoptive cellular therapies will have to be located. But I think it's an exciting space to watch. So I just wanted to finish with a couple of slides on the influence of diet on immunotherapy response. And I like this very busy, very colourful diagram because it really highlights all of the hallmarks of response and toxicity to immune check blockade that we see with host intrinsic factors, many of which we can't change here on the left in the warmer colours, and the extrinsic factors, or this concept of the exposome here on the right in the cooler colours. And there's been a lot of data in recent years about the gut microbiome and its importance in modulating immunotherapy responses. And this can be probably favourably altered by diet. And high fibre foods seem to be the key. And so we've seen that a study published last year showed that patients with a diet sufficient in fibre, and that's quite hard to achieve looking at our Australian guidelines, had improved progression-free survival and improved response rates to immunotherapy. And then in the neoadjuvant context this year, it was seen that a favourable microbiome for response to immune checkpoint therapy was associated with a high fibre diet. And you probably need the right microbiome to process all that fibre in the optimal way. But nonetheless, when patients come into my clinic and everyone wants to know, what can I do to improve my outcome? And normally I'm reeling off a list of things that I'd like them to avoid, such as antibiotics, probiotics and other different things. Now it's nice to be able to say that perhaps increasing dietary fibre, which, aside for some bloating and a bit of gas, can't seem to do much harm, may in fact help improve their microbiome to optimise their responses. So may the progress continue, and thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Lavinia. That was a fantastic run through of some of the really exciting advances that have been happening in the clinical trials space and coming into more routine clinical practice and standard of care now with adjuvant therapies and possibly soon the neoadjuvant approaches. So it's really fantastic. Are there any questions for Lavinia before we move on? Alison, I knew you'd have one. Good, go for it.
Why would you avoid Panadol?
Why would you avoid Panadol?
Yeah, look, I think the data, I haven't gone into that, the data on paracetamol was published this year, actually. It's thought that perhaps there's an immunomodulatory, sort of unfavourable immunomodulatory effect, and they did look at that in some sort of in some translational work as well. I mean, I'm very pragmatic. It's not possible to avoid paracetamol. But, if patients are on it regularly and they don't need to be, it's something that I try and remove.
Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Lavinia. We'll move on to the next part of the program, which is really the highlight, I think, of the MRV session. And Mark, I'll let Mark introduce the Morgan Mansell Prize. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks very much, Tori, and it's a great event and great to see everyone face-to-face after a couple of years of not being able to do that, and congratulations to the speakers so far. Really, really wonderful talks. And I actually want to give Alison a bit of a shout out because I think she underplayed a little bit the role of the MRV's consumer reference group, which has actually been a real pioneer in our field, certainly nationally and really globally, I think, because in fact, in addition to supporting the activities of this group, that consumer reference group, or our consumer reference group through MRV, was actually looking after the entire national clinical trial program via its role as the consumer group that was providing commentary and feedback around clinical trials developed at a national level. They actually took that role on for about 10 years. Which was a wonderful contribution nationally. So it's an amazing group, and continuing under your leadership, Alison. So I really wanted to acknowledge that particularly. So yeah, so I'm a bit biased, and this is kind of but rapidly becoming my personal favourite part of our annual scientific meeting, and it's a real pleasure and privilege, in fact, for me to introduce the nominees for the 2022 Morgan Mansell Prize. By way of brief background, for those of you who haven't heard about this before, so Morgan Mansell was a really wonderful young lady who unfortunately died of melanoma a few years ago. She was a patient of the Monash Hospital, Monash Health, as well as Alfred Health, and I was very fortunate really to be able to, one of the great sort of privileges of my career, to be able to help her and her family through what was a really incredibly difficult time after she transferred across to our care at the Alfred, with in truth what was one of the most complex series of medical problems that I've ever had to deal with in my career. But she was a really inspirational person in the sense that despite all the turmoil that was going on inside her body, she had this remarkable ability to be very outward thinking and to maintain this great concern for others and have a sense of perspective of the big picture, and particularly a wish to contribute such that people in the future wouldn't have to go through what she was going through. So she actually set up foundations linked to her. She was a very wonderful social media guru, and she set up various online fora and that were actually have attracted a lot of attention and still do. And was really a great inspiration to those of us who are fortunate enough to be able to work with her. And so after she died, her parents, Peter and Julie, who are here with us today, and we'll certainly welcome them again, decided to use some of the funds that had been raised to support a prize in her memory. And this is what the Morgan Mansell Prize is. And when we were talking about what would be the best way to make that contribution to our field, we pretty rapidly came to the agreement that the best way to invest that money was actually to think about how it might be leveraged into the future, potentially for many years and possibly generations. And that was by acknowledging and supporting the young gun researchers that we have coming up in our field, often during a career period that's pretty difficult and challenging and requires a lot of support and opportunities through award schemes such as this. So the award has really been set up to recognise. It's a peer-reviewed award. The applicants have got to apply through a fairly rigorous process. Their applications are reviewed by a scientific committee that judge the sort of merits of their work. They're all young and early career stage, and a winner is decided. So, like our previous years, the task that the scientific committee this year was charged with was basically impossible. There were really a number of very, very high quality applicants, which is a great thing for our field to see such talent coming through. But there were three that were selected as finalists, and I'm not going to announce the winner now. But we've got a great opportunity this evening to hear some relatively short talks from each of those finalists about their work, which we're really looking forward to. So three women, which is wonderful to see, and the first one of which is Dr Claire Felmingham. So Claire is actually doing formal dermatology training here in the Australian college-led dermatology training program. She's actually currently rotating at the Northern Hospital. But in recent years, she was one of the dermatology fellows in the Victorian Melanoma Service at the Alfred Hospital, and undertook a project that eventually became part of an MPH degree, which is entitled Use of Artificial Intelligence in Real-World Dermatology Settings. So please welcome Claire to present her work.
Thank you very much. I'm Claire, and I'll be talking about the SMARTI study, Improving Skin Cancer Management with Artificial Intelligence. And so the SMARTI study was a pre-post intervention study undertaken in specialist dermatology setting, and it was investigating the use of a convolutional neural network, which is a type of artificial intelligence, which was used for diagnosing and managing skin cancers. And prior to undertaking this study, other studies had demonstrated that these convolutional neural network CNNs were performing with quite impressive accuracy for diagnosing skin cancers in experimental settings. And so this study then aimed to test this technology out in the real world clinical setting. And so between October 2019 and May 2021, participants were recruited from the patient population attending dermatology clinics at the Alfred Hospital and at the Skin Health Institute. And the intervention involved this mole map camera, which took dermoscopic and macroscopic images of skin lesions and uploaded them to an adjacent computer on which there was the AI software capable of classifying skin lesions as either benign, uncertain, or malignant. And that was a convolutional neural network developed by Monash eResearch and MoleMap. And so in the pre-intervention period, the dermatology registrar would examine the patient, select all skin lesions of concern along with 2 or more non-suspicious skin lesions. They would take images of the lesions and upload them to the computer, where they would record their favoured diagnosis and plan. The consultant dermatologist would then assess the patient and record their favoured diagnosis and plan. And all lesions were later also diagnosed by a teledermatologist remotely and also by the AI algorithm. In the post-intervention period, the process was similar, although now the registrar and the consultant dermatologist, after independently recording their diagnosis and plan initially, they would then submit the images to be assessed by the AI real-time in the clinic, and they would then enter an AI-assisted diagnosis and plan. So there were 214 participants in the study and 743 skin lesions. Of those lesions, 221 were biopsied, 162 were malignant, and that included 45 melanomas. The primary analysis for the study was to compare the AI diagnostic accuracy or lesion classification accuracy with that of the teledermatologists. And the histopathology was used as reference standard where it was available, and the treating consultant dermatologist's assessment was used as the reference standard where histopathology wasn't available. And the AI performed with quite impressive diagnostic accuracy. So the sensitivity was 95.8%, specificity 71.5%, compared to teledermatologist sensitivity 89.5% and specificity 71.9%. And of the 162 biopsied lesions which were malignant, the AI did classify 4% of those incorrectly as benign. In comparison, the teledermatologist's false negative rate was about 9%. Importantly, the registrar's management decisions after interacting with the AI shifted to be more in line with the consultant dermatologist's management decision. And in contrast, the consultant dermatologist's management decision wasn't very much impacted by the AI. There was a slightly higher proportion of biopsied lesions which were benign in the post-intervention period compared to the pre-intervention period, although the difference wasn't statistically significant. So in summary, the AI has performed with a very impressive accuracy on par with teledermatologists. Overall, the AI has had a very positive impact on the registrar's management decisions as well, shifting them to be more in line with the senior dermatologist's management decision. And this was undertaken in a specialist dermatology setting, so further research will be required to determine the safety of the technology in a primary care or general practice setting. And I'd like to thank Associate Professor Victoria Mar and the SMARTI team. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Have we got time for questions at all? Or? Very quick. Has anyone got any questions for Claire? You got one over there.
Is the AI heuristic?
Oh.
Does it learn?
Does it learn? Oh, so yeah, so it's a convolutional neural network. So it's the way that it's trained is to learn from data that it's fed. So it's fed images and told that they're what they are and what type of skin cancer they are or what type of benign lesion they are, and that's how it learns machine learning, deep learning. But the CNN in this study, it wasn't continually learning throughout the study. It did its learning all beforehand. Yeah.
And there's lots of companies, in fact, starting to spring up around the world now, where you kind of get your phone, take a photo, flick it in. Have I got cancer or not? What do you want to make a comment, I guess, about that industry? But I guess particularly, how did you take the photo? Is the way the photo is taken, the image required, how important is that?
Yeah, so the camera, it has this, so this bit here leans against the skin, so it's always the same distance for that macroscopic image, and then it's a good quality dermoscopic image. I suppose anything that's going to be a kind of direct-to-patient tool, there's a risk of kind of image quality interruption. But certainly this tool is intended for use by a clinician, rather than there being any kind of very accurate direct-to-patient tools available.
Great, thanks, Claire. I'm under time pressure from the boss here, so we might move along. So our second finalist is Dr Prachi Bhave. So Prachi is a newly minted medical oncologist, or relatively new, year or two ago, who came through our training program here in Melbourne and spent some time in Sydney at the Melanoma Institute of Australia, and recently has come back to the Melbourne environment, which is great for us and for our field. She's actually in the first year of a PhD here at Peter Mac, where she's investigating biomarkers relating to adverse outcomes, particularly in early stage melanomas. So it's great to have Prachi along. Hi, Prachi. I know Prachi very well. She worked in our team 3 years ago or so. It's great to see you finally actually in 3 dimensions rather than on Zoom. Thanks Prachi.
Mark. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Mark. So, yes, I'm going to be presenting one of the projects I worked on earlier this year, which actually started when I was in Sydney, and I did the majority of the work when I moved back to Melbourne this year, looking at the effectiveness of immunotherapy in acral melanoma. And basically, just in terms of some context, acral melanoma is actually quite a rare subtype of melanoma, and it originates from non-hair-bearing skin, so the palms of our hands, soles of our feet, and also the nail beds, which I've got some images of over there. And it is biologically very different from the usual cutaneous skin melanoma that we talk about. It's different in terms of its genetics, also its etiology. For example, it's not really linked to UV exposure. And importantly, acral melanoma patients weren't identified as a specific subgroup in the important clinical trials that we talk about as oncologists in our clinical practice. So we will often refer to these trials and talk about the chances of response or chances of cure to our patients, but we're really using cutaneous melanoma data rather than acral melanoma data. And that's not great because the two diseases are actually quite different. So the study I undertook was, I guess, trying to address this unmet need. It was a multi-centre retrospective cohort analysis. We looked at Australian data as well as several international sites, and we pulled the data together. And we have to do this because it's so rare. There's really, very few cases in Australia every year, so we really need to pull data internationally to get any good numbers. And our aims were to look at the effectiveness of combination immunotherapy, so that's anti-PD-1, meaning nivolumab or pembrolizumab, plus anti-CTLA-4, which is ipilimumab, and compare it to single-agent immunotherapy, and also to determine if the site of the acral melanoma affected response and outcomes. So there is some data to suggest that actually the acral melanoma is different depending on whether it originates from the nail bed or the soles of your foot. So we wanted to see if that translated to different response rates to immunotherapy. And we published our work early this year in the Journal for Immunotherapy and Cancer. And basically, the significance of our study was that it is the largest data set, I guess, on the in terms of acral melanoma patients and their outcomes that we have so far. It's the first to really systematically look at the site of origin of acral melanoma and immunotherapy efficacy, and also the first to look at combination immunotherapy in a large number of patients. So in terms of results, looking at response rate, in a minute, we actually had about 370 patients from 26 sites around the world, which we were pretty happy with because it is, as I said, such a rare diagnosis. Of the cohort, 25 had melanoma from the palm, 260 patients had melanoma from the soles of the foot, and 84 had nail bed acral melanoma. And if you look at response rate, and this is really, if patients ask us in clinic, well, what is the chance that my melanoma will shrink to the treatment that you're going to give me? This is what we look at as oncologists for response rate. We can see in the table down the bottom that the response rate was 43%, that top row, to combination immunotherapy, compared to 26% on the left with just single agent anti-PD-1, and only 15% with ipilimumab. So we can see that combination treatment was significantly better, which is similar to what we see in cutaneous melanoma. And if we look at the logistic regression and the p-values, which oncologists are obsessed about, we can see that the p-values were significant for both the higher response rate with combination and the inferior response rate with ipilimumab. And also on that table on the right, looking at the second section there about primary site, we can actually see that there wasn't a difference in response rate depending on where the melanoma originated from. And then looking at survival, looking at the curves on the left, to start off with, that's progression-free survival. So what are the chances that the patient will not have progression of their melanoma and survive? We can see that in the blue curve there, ipilimumab was definitely inferior to the other options, again with a significant p-value on both univariable and multivariable analysis. But we can see that even in the orange curve, it looked like combination was better than anti-PD-1 for progression-free survival, but the p-value wasn't significant. And looking at overall survival on the right, we can see that there actually wasn't much of a difference between all three arms, which isn't that surprising in a retrospective analysis. There can be lots of confounders that lead to a result like that. And also, I haven't presented the results here, but we didn't find any difference in progression-free or overall survival by primary site. So just to conclude, this was the largest study to look at efficacy and safety of checkpoint inhibitors in acral melanoma. The safety data, which I haven't presented, was actually very similar to cutaneous melanoma, so it doesn't seem to be more toxic in acral melanoma. The study is the first to look at the combination treatment and its efficacy. It does look like it has a higher response rate, and it does seem to indicate a better survival, though we didn't see that clearly. And if we are to compare to cutaneous melanoma, and it is across studies, which we shouldn't be doing, we can definitely see that the response rate is less than skin or cutaneous melanoma. And I didn't show it here, but actually the duration of response was only a couple of months. So even if patients are responding, within 2 or 3 months, they were progressing, which is, again, very different to what we see in cutaneous melanoma. And we really need more studies to look at this group. They're very rare, so I think it'll be very hard to have clinical trials just with acral melanoma patients only. But as long as they're included in the larger general melanoma trials, that would be the first step. And even looking at all the new advances that Lavinia just spoke about, like neoadjuvant treatment, making sure we're also exploring that in acral melanoma. And that's it.
Thanks, Sarah. Any questions for Prachi? No questions? Okay, all right, we'll move on. Sonia, that'll keep Sonia happy at least. So our last finalist is Peinan Zhao. There she is. I'm just trying to find her. So it's a real pleasure to introduce Peinan. So, one of the great things about being a researcher is the ability to work with people that have got expertise in actually quite different fields and come from different backgrounds, and then just sort of bring them into an environment and see the different perspectives that they can bring. So unlike our first two speakers tonight, who both come through like a medical stream, and many others finalists in previous years that have come through a standard sort of science stream. So Peinan actually has come from an electrical engineering and computer engineering stream, which is really cool. And so she is currently in the second year, I think, of a PhD through Monash University, where she's attempting to come up with creative ways to think about integrating very complex and very large molecular data sets that we're now deriving these days from patient melanomas and from other sources. It's a very tricky space, I'll be honest with you. I don't quite fully understand what she does most of the time, but it's very cool. But the ability to bring those skills and then apply them to actual clinical questions that we have, I think it's really exciting to see her work in that way. So her project is entitled Genomic Comparison of Primary Dermal Melanomas and Subcutaneous Metastatic Melanomas, which is a major clinical conundrum that we have very frequently in our multidisciplinary meetings. Please come up, Peinan.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming this evening. I'm Peinan, and the project that I'm going to talk about is comparing primary dermal melanoma, which is a rare melanoma subtype that arises from and confined to the dermis layer of the skin. Histologically, primary dermal melanoma, or PDM, is very similar to another melanoma subtype, subcutaneous metastatic melanoma, or SCM. Despite their histological similarities, the patient outcomes of PDMs and SCMs are actually very distinct. Based on previous studies, the 5-year survival rate of PDMs are significantly better than those patients with SCMs. However, it is quite clinically challenging to accurately diagnose PDMs and SCMs, and currently there's no known molecular markers which could assist this diagnosis decisions. And based on the hypothesis that those patient prognosis could potentially be improved with some genomic markers comparing to the current approaches just based on clinical features and histological features. The goal of this study is to find those markers that improve the patient prognostication. So to achieve this, William and Louis recruited a cohort of PDM and SCM patients. Chris collected their clinical data and analyzed them. Pacman and Jen from Shackleton laboratory processed the patient samples and subjected them to the genomic sequencing using TSO 500. So TSO 500 is actually a targeted sequencing panel which covers about 500 well-known cancer genes. And from the initial TSO 500 report, interestingly, from the top right panel figure, we could see some of the genes were recurrently amplified in multiple cases in SCM cohorts, but not in PDMs. This is implying that there might be some distinctive features in the copy number profiles of those tumors that could help us identify them. Therefore, we established an analysis pipeline to infer the copy number profiles using the genomic sequencing data from TSO 500. And from there, we could actually estimate the copy ratio of each gene and the overall copy number variation load. From that, we actually find that there are 7 genes which has a significantly higher copy number ratio in SCM comparing to PDM. And very interestingly, all of those 7 are well-known oncogenes. In addition, we find that in 3 cases of SCM, there are extreme focal amplifications of a small genomic regions. One of the most striking cases actually has a 70-fold change in a genomic region covering oncogene PTGFRA. So this feature, this extreme amplifications, is actually implying the presence of potential extra chromosomal DNA, which has been increasingly recognized as a potential mechanism that drives the cancer progression in multiple cancer types. Lastly, we want to go back to our question of whether and what genomic markers could actually improve the patient prognostications. So we used a Cox regression to identify the features and established a predictive model for patients' recurrence-free survival or event-free survival. We found that BRAF copy number alone is the best molecular marker that predicts the patient prognosis. Furthermore, we find that when we combine the initial diagnosis of whether SCM or PDM with the BRAF copy number, the model performance actually achieves the best. In the other words, the patient's recurrence or death is most significantly associated with the initial diagnosis of SCM and BRAF copy number gain. In conclusion, we find that the prognostication of PDM and SCM patients could be improved when we incorporating the molecular markers such as BRAF copy number along with the initial clinical diagnosis. In addition, we find that comparing to PDM, there are significant copy number gains in oncogenes and presence of extra chromosomal DNAs in SCM, which is hinting that the structural genomic dearrangement could be a potential disease driver that's linked with melanoma disease progression. Lastly, I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to this study. They're listed on the slide. And I'd like also to acknowledge Australian College of Dermatology to fund the genomic sequencing and all the patients and families who donated the samples and supported our study. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much, Peinan. We're in good hands, aren't we, with this young crop coming through. Any questions for Peinan?
How practical is it to diagnose it in the clinic? You have to do sequencing to differentiate between the two types.
Yeah, I mean, you have a crack at answering if you want, but I'll probably throw to Tori to answer that one because she's the one who deals with this stuff all the time. So
yeah, so I might rely on Tori, but so current diagnosis of PDM and SCM is primarily based on the clinical histories of the patients, whole body imaging, and lymph node biopsies to trace if there's any potential of existing melanoma as well. So this is a diagnosis of exclusion, and we're hoping that as the sequencing prices drops down, there is a potential to incorporate those genomic markers into the actual clinical diagnosis progress.
Tori, how much of a challenge is this for you guys in clinic?
Yeah, I mean, we see it not too uncommonly when you get a referral of a patient that histopathology shows that there's no epidermal component and that there's just a nodule in the dermis, and the pathologist is sort of saying clinical pathological correlation. It could be a metastasis or it could be a primary tumour, and so it's quite anxiety-provoking for patients, I think, to have that uncertainty in their diagnosis. And we would usually take a good history around any lesions that might have been excised in the vicinity, or could this potentially be met from elsewhere if they've had a history. And so they'll have PET scans and so on just to try to rule that out. But there is still an element of uncertainty as to whether it was truly a primary or perhaps this or perhaps a metastatic deposit. So it can be tricky. So trying to understand that better is, I think.
So I guess the take home from this is if you did have that conundrum in the clinic and you did sequencing and you identified areas or particularly those card-carrying melanoma oncogenes that have got increased copy number based on genomic, that it's far more likely, in fact, to be a metastasis than it is to be a primary dermal melanoma. So it should help the diagnostic certainty. And that's linked to, in fact, prognosis estimation, which makes sense.
And sometimes they can be very large deposits and actually quite big you know, depending on the big lesions that you think will, and it's good to know.
Because the treatment's very different, of course. So, yeah. Anyway, that's enough science. So thank you so much to the speaker. Thank you all, actually, all of the applicants, even those who didn't make the final list. Thank you so much for applying. And like I said, the quality, the scientific review committee, who also should be thanked, you know, basically have an impossible job. We find pretty much every year, and I think you can see by the quality of the talks we've had this evening that it was an easy job. I might ask Peter or Julie or both, Mansell, to come up, Morgan's parents, to present the award, which I have here, which I can't get out of the box. Here it is. So, yeah, so it's my pleasure to, I'll give you guys this award, to name the 2022 Morgan Mansell Prize winner as Dr Prachi Bhave. Prachi, please come up.
Thank you. Oh, wow, it's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, photo time.
Photo time.
Actually, maybe.
Thank you so much. Oh, yeah.
Don't tell the CEO. Okay, so that concludes the formal part of the evening in terms of scientific presentations. Tori, are you or I rounding it off? I think it's probably you. Is that right? I think you should do it.
All right. So I think, yeah, it's really lovely. Thank you to all our speakers tonight. Thank you particularly to our young researchers who contribute to the MRV program broadly, and to our finalists tonight. It's a fantastic display of the breadth of melanoma research that is happening across this state, but also really active collaborations on a national scale with many, many projects branching out across the states too. So thank you, and look forward to more progress over the coming 12 months. Thank you to our consumers who provide so much input, and let's go and have some discussion after this. Thank you.